Today's episode is sponsored by 4Days. They're one of our favorite closed-loop sustainable clothing brands. Our favorite product of theirs is the Take Back bag. You just fill it up with clothes in any condition from any brand, send it back with the prepaid shipping label, and get an instant credit. They work with partners to recycle, downcycle, and upcycle what you send in. All those clothes you can't donate or resell, this is how you keep them out of landfills, save water, and prevent a ton of CO2 emissions. Pretty neat. All right, Definers, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability, one concept and one bad joke at a time. This is episode 61 on carbon pricing. Scott, this has been one I know we've had on our radars for a long time, and we finally got here.
It's so important. I mean, Jay, we have our buckets, right, on our tree. We don't talk enough about the tree, but we have a whole policy bucket. We haven't done one in a while. It can get a little dense, but I think people are going to learn a lot, and this is an important topic.
Absolutely. So, Scott, walk us through what this episode's going to look like.
All right, so first we'll get into what is carbon pricing, right? And then we'll discuss when did carbon pricing start and who came up with it. Where does carbon pricing exist today? What are the positives and the negatives of carbon pricing, and is there an alternative? How are the most effective carbon pricing systems structured? Then we'll discuss who are the leading people and groups advocating for a price on carbon. And lastly, Jay, we're going to introduce our expert guest, Marc Hafstead of Resources for the Future.
Can't wait.
Can't wait. All right.
Cannot wait.
Well, you're going to have to wait. So first is, what is carbon pricing? Okay, so the World Bank defines carbon pricing as an instrument that captures the external costs of greenhouse gas emissions, or GHG, and ties those costs to their sources, usually in the form of a price on the carbon dioxide, CO2, emitted. The external costs from GHG emissions include damage to crops, healthcare costs from heat waves and droughts, and loss of property from flooding and sea level rise. So basically all the things we talk about, Jay, that are the ramifications of climate change. So,
exactly.
To put it simply, putting a price on carbon makes entities incorporate the cost of their impact on the climate.
So a price on carbon helps address the fact that climate impacts are often endured by people who are neither the producer nor the consumer of something that exacerbated climate change. Consider someone who lives on the coast impacted by rising sea levels from carbon emissions, many of which came from power plants that produce power in a location and for people far away from this hypothetical person on the coastline. So this issue of someone not involved in a transaction facing a negative impact from that transaction is referred to in economics as a negative externality.
And that's probably going to be the answer to the $500 question in the category of economics terms. What is
Scott,
negative externality?
Can I ask you a question, Scott?
Yeah.
Were you vetted to fit Alex Trebek's role?
Definitely not.
That's a crying shame for all of us.
All right, so let's stay with the basics, Jay, and explore how carbon pricing works. So to set a price on carbon, the government must first determine what to charge per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this gets tricky, as economists, scientists, and government officials must all agree on this cost and what assumptions to use. For example, one study we found said that warming could be limited to 2 degrees if a carbon price of $30 per ton is set and rises to $107 per ton in 2050. Now contrast this with what the UN recommended, a carbon tax of between $135 and $5,500 per ton, yeah, good luck, by 2030 to keep overall global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've got a wide range of what is that optimal price per ton. Now, at this time of what prices are currently in place, they're not set high enough to have a significant impact on climate change. A recent report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, estimated that in 2018, the carbon pricing gap, which contrasts actual carbon prices and real climate costs, was 76.5%. Now, that gap's closing, but not at a fast rate. And with the current pace of decline in that carbon pricing gap, real costs won't be met by the carbon prices until 2095.
I think that's maybe a little far.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to be around,
Scott.
Jay. I don't know. Now, in efforts to close that carbon price gap, French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, Bruno Le Maire?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Called for a global minimum price for carbon emissions in the July 2020 meeting of the G20. We got some late-breaking news in these internets, Jay.
That's exactly right. Hot off the press.
Yeah.
All right, so we're talking carbon pricing. Let's break it down a little bit. There are two main types of carbon pricing. We have emissions trading systems, also known as ETS, not to be confused with BTS, of course, and carbon taxes. So ETS, which is, again, emission trading systems, introduce a cap and trade system, which caps the total level of greenhouse gas emissions. This cap comes from the government issuing a limited number of permits called emissions allowances, each of which granting the holder the right to emit 1 ton of CO2. So if the cap is 10,000 tons of carbon, there could be 10,000 1-ton allowances made available, and those that emit carbon would need an allowance for those carbon emissions. In this system, there is certainty as to how much carbon will be emitted, but not certainty on how much it costs. The market sets the price because once the permits are given out by auction or by allowance from the government, they typically can be traded, and the market determines what the ability to emit a ton of carbon dioxide is worth. So that's the first type, emission trading systems. The second type of carbon pricing is carbon taxes, which sets a fixed price that must be paid for every ton of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere. So unlike ETS, in this approach, there is certainty on the price, but it's unclear how much carbon emissions would actually occur.
Right. And Jay, I have to admit, when I started researching this episode, I thought carbon price was just carbon tax. I didn't know it necessarily included both. And I was like, oh, wow, this episode's got to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, it does. But I think that's so critical, right? Because like if both you and I were under that impression, I mean, it needs to be conveyed, right?
Yeah. Okay, so when did carbon pricing start and who came up with it? Little history, Jay.
Professor Scott.
Yeah. This will be on the final. So carbon pricing efforts are relatively new in the green movement, but they've had quite the rocky road when it comes to passing legislation. The idea of needing a price on carbon can be traced back to 1920, when an economist named Arthur Pigou, no relation to Mr. Magoo, introduced the idea of putting a price... Nothing, Jay? Not even a laugh, Mr.
Oh,
Magoo?
you can't hear me? You can't hear me chuckling? Come on.
Okay. Introduced the idea of putting a price on negative externalities. Hopefully listeners remember negative externalities. We had the person in the remote island experiencing sea level rise by faraway power plants. Okay, so hopefully you remember that. We get it's a dense episode. I hope you're sticking with us. But to refresh your memory, negative externality, it occurs when an economic activity exerts a negative effect on a third party that was independent of the economic activity. Okay, so Pigou is saying put a price on that. Now, globally, Finland was the world's first country to introduce a carbon tax, and that was in 1990. Since then, 16 countries have followed. Now, in terms of the cap and trade option, the world's first was the European Union Emission Trading System, or EU ETS. That was launched in 2005, and today it's the world's largest carbon market.
All right, so that's big picture, that's global. Let's talk about here in the U.S. So locally here, the first proposal for a price on carbon was in 1990 in the U.S. House of Representatives by Representative Pete Stark, a liberal Democrat from California. Scott, I'm realizing I almost said, so domestically, the first proposal for a price on carbon, and it gives me so much heat for saying the word domestic, like domestic travel and stuff. So I don't know if that's a common word you use, but I get some heat for it. How do you feel?
Well, I use it, but is she saying it because it's like so American-centric of you, like we're the center of the world or something? Or
Oh, no. It's kind of like, let's say, for example, I'm going to do some domestic travel before I visit my sister in New Zealand. She's like, well, that's just, it's local travel, or it's national travel. And I'm like,
nah,
well,
that's,
So my question is like, do I sound like a goober for saying domestic? Okay.
No.
Scott, thank you.
But listeners, please write us emails, post on Instagram, reach out to us if you feel differently.
Please. All right. So again, 1990, the first proposal for a price on carbon was introduced. Since then, in the U.S., over 50 nationwide carbon pricing bills have been introduced.
And how many passed, Jay?
None
have
passed.
I mean,
however,
shoot.
however, that's got, I like the edge you got there.
Oh, okay. Keep it in. Note to Keaton.
However, there has been success at the state level. 12 states have active cap and trade systems, and collectively, they account for a third of the U.S. GDP. 11 eastern states make up the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI.
Which is the name of my childhood dog. Yes.
Can I tell you something, Scott? I at one point named my iPhone RGGI, and I haven't touched it in like a decade, but it's still, like when it shows up on people's Bluetooth, it shows up as RGGI. So
just because like you wanted an affectionate name for your phone?
Yeah, and I guess the time RGGI fit. So here we are, full circle. RGGI is far more important here than it is in my pocket. So those are 11 eastern states. We have California on the other side of the country, which has its own cap and trade program. And it's associated with the programs in the Canadian provinces of Quebec and Nova Scotia via the Western Climate Initiative Incorporated. And in the spring of 2021, Washington State enacted into law a, quote, cap and invest program that will use the revenue from the carbon credits to increase sustainable transportation and climate change resilience.
Cap and invest. Now that's a good label for this. That sounds good, doesn't it?
It's great marketing right there.
And we're going to talk more about that law in just a bit. But additionally, nearly half of the largest 500 companies in the world by market value, they already have an internal carbon price or intend to adopt one in the coming 2 years. So we link in the intro notes to a Yale University report on internal carbon pricing that has case studies on organizations that have an internal price on carbon. The case studies they have in this report come from Yale University itself, Microsoft, and Delta Airlines. Also in our sustainable beer episode, Jay, internal pricing comes up in our original and updated conversations with Katie Wallace of New Belgium Brewing, because they did it.
Cheers to that, Scott.
All right.
Okay, so quickly, let's ask, where does carbon pricing actually exist today? So as of May 2021, a couple months ago, there are 64 carbon pricing policies in operation, which represent 61 countries and 22% of global emissions. Of all the world's developed economies, only Australia and the United States have no form of nationwide carbon pricing in place. Alternatively, if you look at the largest 20 economies, the only other holdouts are India and a few Persian Gulf oil states, who I might imagine might not fall on this side, but a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, a little disappointing. Okay, so Jay, let's think about this issue some more and look at the positives and negatives of carbon pricing and consider, is there an alternative? So carbon pricing, we have this legitimate tool we can utilize to reduce global emissions, but let's look at the positives and negatives of this approach. So let's talk positives. Always good to start with the positives, right, Jay?
Oh, of course.
All right. So the first one is carbon pricing motivates companies to switch to clean energy by increasing the cost of carbon-based fuels. So we get that financial incentive. Mm-hmm. The second positive is that it is possible for the economy to grow while a price on carbon is in place. For example, Sweden. It has had a carbon tax since 1991, and one study looked at the carbon tax through 2017 and found that in those years, its emissions were reduced by 26%, while its GDP grew by 78%. That's pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Okay, third positive. A price on carbon raises substantial revenue that can be used for a variety of purposes. Those purposes include reimbursing government agencies administering the carbon pricing scheme, providing dividends to consumers to help with any price increases that may come from the carbon price. And we're going to touch more on this idea of like raising revenue from carbon prices and giving them out as dividends later in the episode. And thirdly, you can use the revenue to fund research for innovations that can help in the fight against climate change. Now, we're talking significant dough here of what we, money that we can raise and spend on some stuff. The Congressional Budget Office estimated in 2011 that a carbon tax starting at $20 per ton and increasing to $34.40 per ton would raise $1.2 trillion just in the first decade. And these days, we're often talking larger cost per ton. Remember those ranges earlier in the episode, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars.
All right, well, Scott, transitioning a little bit, I know that over COVID, I told you that one of my favorite pastimes was this new, most amazing show called The Great British Bake Off that I found.
Right.
And in every episode, they name the baker that's done the best in that episode, and then they send someone home. And there's 2 hosts that do it. Okay. So one person comes on, and the first one's like, well, I get to announce Star Baker this week. And they give it to someone. And then the other person comes on and like, all right, well, I've got the bad news this week and have to send someone home. I feel like that person. We've talked about the pros of carbon pricing, and here I am to kind of just dampen the mood. So,
but we both have British accents in this hypothetical? Because that's cool.
We do. So, Scott, we need to actually get into gear.
Cheerio.
Real quick. All right. So, the first negative we come to, relatively obvious, is that with a carbon pricing system, the utilization and reliance on carbon will still exist. And as the utilization of carbon continues, fossil fuel-fired power plants may continue to operate and emit air and water pollutants in neighborhoods already burdened by pollution. So that's number one. Number two, by making fossil fuels more expensive, it potentially imposes a harsher burden on those with low incomes.
Okay, so a bit more on that one. If you make fossil fuels more expensive, you could have that disproportionate impact on low-income consumers because now you've got price spikes on things like public transportation and consumer goods that people rely on.
Okay, so Scott, we've talked about 2 potential negatives of carbon pricing. We have 2 more to touch on. The third one is that it can be difficult to measure how much carbon is produced and therefore difficult to know what is the appropriate or effective price to actually set for carbon. Mm-hmm. And then number 4, it could shift manufacturing production to nations without a price on carbon. So if that were to occur, not much would have been accomplished in a fight on carbon, since obviously a ton of carbon emitted has the same effect no matter where it is on Earth.
And Jay, this is often referred to as leakage, which is the answer for economics terms for 200.
I don't know what to call you, like Scott, like Mr. Host Scott, or like Professor Breen here.
Again, like keep going.
All right, so one tool being used to address this is a carbon border adjustment tax. Carbon border adjustment taxes are taxes on imports and rebates on exports that account for variance in carbon pricing policies across different countries. It's meant to protect domestic manufacturers, again, domestic, here we go, facing higher costs from a price on carbon policy and ensure progress in the fight against climate change. The EU is including a carbon border adjustment tax in its, quote, Fit for 55, which is a massive package of 12 laws to help the EU reduce its carbon emissions by about 55% over the next decade. And also in July 2021, again, hot off the press, right, Democrats in the U.S. Congress proposed a carbon border adjustment tax as a way to raise revenue in their $3.5 trillion budget plan.
Yeah, no, this carbon border adjustment tax, I don't know if you've seen it in the news, Jay. I've seen it a bunch. So if listeners, if you want to Google News this, you're going to see a lot of articles.
Awesome.
Okay, so in terms of whether there is an alternative to cap and trade and carbon tax, there's really not one that's garnered a lot of attention. We looked around and we did see there is this 2020 journal article that puts forth something called Sustainability Transition Policy, or STP. And the authors argue that carbon pricing has 5 major issues, including that it places particular weight on efficiency as opposed to effectiveness. And they also say that it tends to stimulate the optimization of existing systems rather than trying to transform the system. So, in short, STP argues for a policy mix that promotes innovation and decline of carbon emissions, accounts for political dynamics, varies between sectors and over time, and aims at profound system change. So, there is an alternative, but really these 2 are what people look at in making policy: carbon tax and cap and trade.
Right. So, Scott, naturally, let's then ask, how are the most effective carbon pricing systems actually structured?
Right.
So different government officials, economists, and scientists all may disagree on what constitutes a, quote, effective carbon pricing system. An economist may argue that a carbon pricing policy that reduces the overall financial burden on everyday citizens is most efficient. And then on the other hand, a scientist may push for a carbon pricing policy that results in the biggest reduction in emissions.
So when designing an effective carbon pricing system, there are 3 different design factors that Resources for the Future has highlighted that can influence the overall effectiveness of introducing a carbon pricing policy. These include policy stringency, coverage, and revenue use. So whenever you read about a carbon pricing system, you can think about it on these 3 dynamics. Mm-hmm. So the first one is policy stringency. And this looks at how a carbon tax or emissions cap will change over time. For example, higher taxes or lower emission caps will result in more substantial emissions reductions, but they're going to increase the overall cost of people complying with the system. Now, coverage controls which sectors must follow the carbon pricing system and which emission types are covered by the carbon price, because sometimes things are exempted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the third design factor is revenue use. Now, this can be strategic. You can make carbon pricing policies more progressive, minimizing negative impacts on low-income households, or even benefiting them by redistributing the revenue in areas of need.
All right, so I love the way this piece is set up. So,
yeah.
Scott, kudos to you, and kudos, of course, to Amelia Kovac, our new researcher. But we are going to take these three different pieces, Scott, that you just walked us through, and apply these to the forthcoming Washington State, quote, cap and invest program that we mentioned earlier. So, number one, we had policy stringency. So Washington State's law has emission targets for 2030, which is 50 million metric tons, for 2040 at 27 million metric tons, and then at 2050, which is 5 million metric tons.
So the cap gets lower over time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, we have this coverage piece. Washington's bill covers the state's 100 largest emitters, which is about 75% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions.
So I bet the 101 largest was like, oh man, just skated by.
Wipe off the old brow.
Yeah.
However, Scott, this coverage angle on Washington's bill, it does omit certain so-called, quote, non-point sources like those from agriculture. So one piece to consider there.
Non-point sources being where you don't exactly know where it came from. There's not one.
Exactly.
Like, oh, this machine emitted the emissions. It's more dispersed. You can't point to one source.
Right. Or I think we're talking agriculture, like fertilizer runoff. It's like got too much nitrogen, but who knows like what part it's coming from. Yeah. So the third piece we're talking about is revenue use. This Washington State bill is forecast to raise at least $460 million in the fiscal year that starts July 1st, 2023, and at least $580 million annually by 2040. Scott, serious dough we're talking about here.
Serious dough.
The money would then be invested in a broad range of activities that include restoration of marine and fresh waters, forest health, renewable energy, and public transportation. Now, the bill stipulates that at least 35% of the program's investments be made in vulnerable communities, with an additional 10% for tribal lands. It also incorporates input from an Environmental Justice Council, which, Scott, we're talking about this more recently, of course. Nice to see it reflected here, too.
Totally. Making sure that those, safeguards are in place and establishing a floor is good. So who are the leading people and groups advocating for a price on carbon? One is the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. It brings together leaders from government, private sector, academia, and civil society to expand the use of carbon pricing policies. The CPLC Secretariat, a fancy word for its administrative leadership, comes from the World Bank, so World Bank's involved. And in 2021, it released its fifth Carbon Pricing Leadership Report. It highlights examples of leadership in the field of carbon pricing in 2020 and 2021. The intention is to inspire governments, business leaders, and other relevant stakeholders from around the world to use carbon pricing as a tool for effective climate action in support of sustainable development. And Jay, this is Shannon and I watched tonight the episode of The Office where they have the Dundies.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and this is reminding me of that. Like, they should have a award ceremony based on this report.
So long as those blue, like, alcoholic drinks.
Yeah, and Dwight's at the keyboard making appropriate sound effects.
All right, so we also have the Climate Leadership Council, or CLC, which was founded by Tad Holstead. He joined forces with former Secretaries of State James Baker and George Shultz to publish in 2017 The Conservative Case for Climate Dividends. The CLC is focused on continuing the momentum toward a solution where there is a gradually rising carbon fee, a carbon dividend for all Americans, simple regulations, and a border adjustment tax. Now, recent research by Marc Hafstead, who is the celeb we're interviewing here in just a second, projects that a carbon pricing plan from the CLC would reduce U.S. energy-related carbon emissions by more than 50% by 2035 relative to 2005 levels.
Okay, very nice. So another leadership group to point out is the Citizens Climate Lobby. Since 2009, CCL has been advocating for the policy carbon fee and dividend. Now, one such bill that would establish a carbon fee and dividend that it supports is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, or EICDA. And according to CCL's website that tracks support for the EICDA, there are 1,193 companies that support it, 150 local governments, 298 nonprofits, and 1 Don Cheadle. Now, presumably, Jay, if they had 5 Don Cheadles, this bill would be passing.
We've been watching all these Marvel movies in order, which I recommend to anybody else, with quarantine amounts of time on your hands. But I've had a lot of Don Cheadle in my life recently, and I would love to have 4 more.
Because he was in Iron Man?
He's in Iron Man, and then he's in some of the Avengers after that, I believe.
As the same character?
Yeah, he's the same guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's only one Don Cheadle.
My God. All right, so with all 5 Don Cheadles in tow, let's start transitioning now to our interview coming up with our special guest, Marc Hafstead. So Marc Hafstead is certainly one of the leading people on carbon pricing. He is a fellow at Resources for the Future and director of their carbon pricing initiative. Resources for the Future, or RFF, is a nonprofit, independent research institution in Washington, D.C. that seeks to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. With Stanford professor and RFF University fellow Lawrence H. Golder, he also wrote Confronting the Climate Challenge, U.S. Policy Options, to evaluate the environmental and economic impacts of carbon taxes, cap and trade programs, clean energy standards, and gasoline taxes. His research also analyzes the distributional and employment impacts of carbon pricing. Scott, clearly this guy is just brilliant. And I am excited to dive into what he's got to say.
Totally. And I have to say, Jay, Resources for the Future, I think fellow young people in D.C. who are interested in environmental issues probably have the same story, where I definitely have had at least 5 free lunches going to Resources for the Future seminars, because they're great. They host speakers, and then I've had definitely some potbelly sandwiches on RFF. So
I was about to say what they served, and potbelly is a fantastic option.
Particularly the oatmeal chocolate chip cookie.
Oh, Scott, here we go. Now we're talking.
All right,
sorry. Enough about cookies. Let's start transitioning over to our interview with Marc Hafstead.
Awesome.
So back to that brand we mentioned before called 4 Days. They've created something pretty revolutionary that they call a swap system. It was designed to help eliminate clothing waste, save water, and prevent CO2 emissions. Plus, it's super easy to use. How it works is you buy a product from them and do whatever you want to it. At any time, send it back to them in any condition, and you'll get an instant credit to use on new favorites. They close the loop and save resources by recycling, downcycling, and upcycling your old stuff. Plus, their clothing is recyclable and ethically made with organic cotton and non-toxic dyes. Plus, they purchase carbon offsets on your behalf with all orders over $35. When it comes to sustainable, zero-waste clothing, they check all the boxes and have some pretty cool new styles that just came in. Even better, Definers get 15% off their purchase with the code DEFINED15, that's DEFINED 15, at 4days, FORDAYS.com. All right, Definers, welcome to the interview portion of our episode on carbon pricing. We are so excited to have Dr. Marc Hafstead joining us today. He is a fellow and the director of the Carbon Pricing Initiative at Resources for the Future. So, Marc, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Marc, let's start towards the beginning. We know you got your BA in mathematical methods in the social sciences and economics at Northwestern, and then you got your PhD in economics from Stanford, 2 schools some folks might have heard of. Yeah. But tell us how you got interested in carbon pricing in particular. Was it something you were exposed to perhaps during your days in undergrad and grad school? When did it strike you?
So I did not go into grad school expecting to be an environmental economist or
Hmm.
a kind of a specialist in carbon pricing. When I started at Stanford, coming out of Northwestern, I kind of viewed myself more as a macroeconomist
Hmm.
and kind of concentrated my studies there. In the middle of my third year, I needed to find a research assistant position to support my grad school work. And there was an opening with environmental economist Larry Goulder, who's looking for someone who had coding skills, which I had. And so it was kind of actually through my research assistant with Larry that I became interested in carbon pricing and carbon pricing modeling. So I kind of fell into it. I never even took an environmental economics class in either
Wow.
undergrad or grad school. And so it's just through the work I've done with Larry starting around 2008, and then going from there. So even when I was kind of leaving grad school, I was still kind of like 50-50 whether I was going to be focused more on macroeconomics or environmental economics. And so when I ended up at Resource of the Future, that was a great place where I could kind of do both in a way that really focused on carbon pricing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's nice that you fell into it. I think we're all benefiting from it because now you're sharing all this knowledge. And I guess it also shows the value of coding skills. You never know where that's going to take you. But you mentioned how Resource for the Future was a great place for you to end up. And we like it because it's got this focus on providing impartial economic research and policy engagement to improve environmental, energy, and natural resources decisions. And Jay, I know you and I try to be impartial here. I mean, we're not afraid to share our opinions, and listeners kind of know where we are on most things. But Mark, we're wondering, as you do your research, I mean, how do you keep impartial? I mean, you just like any human, you've got your own opinions. How is it hard at times? How do you do that?
So I think being impartial is staying away from advocacy and not trying to tell people they should do something,
Hmm.
but tell people if you do this, then this will be the outcome. If you do that, then that will be the outcome, and let people make their own subjective decisions on what that should be. And so really, what I try to focus on is just providing the information variant. So for carbon pricing, like how you use the revenues. So just give people the information about what the different economic impacts of different revenue uses are, and then let them decide what outcomes they want to focus on and choose which form of revenue recycling they might prefer. So, as an economist, obviously, I support carbon pricing as almost all economists do, but that's grounded in the research, and so I feel like that's not a it's not an advocacy position, and I don't advocate for specific policies to policymakers. So having being an economist and being supportive of carbon pricing, I feel is grounded in the research, and so some people might say that's not impartial, but I would argue it is.
Right. I mean, you're just following where the research takes you, and I guess that leads me to my next question, though. Of has the research ever led you somewhere that you weren't expecting? You might have had one opinion, and then you did some modeling and whatnot, and you said, "Oh my God, I actually now think a different way."
I don't think there's been any one kind of like aha moment like that. Um, for a long time, the research that I had been doing showed that um, rebating the revenues was kind of the most inefficient way to use the revenues, and so that was kind of our focus.
Like the
But as people
dividends sort
became
of thing, you mean, when you say rebates?
exactly
Okay.
exactly, which is true, which is because you're not using the revenue to maybe get rid of other inefficient taxes. But there's a in the last when I started this in 2008, 2009, 2010, people weren't really talking about the distributional issues of carbon pricing, and so in the last 5 years, I think that's been much more of a focus is kind of these equity implications. And so there's really this like trade-off on dividends that they're actually really good for low-income people because the dividends are greater than the increase in their energy prices.
Sure.
And so a lot of people, low-income people, would come out ahead. And so that comes to, so it's not something that was necessarily a surprise, but it's something that I hadn't focused on a lot in my initial research. And so now we have to think about, well, what is the equity efficiency trade-off, and present that to policymakers.
Mark, I think that's actually a really interesting point, and it sounds like your research almost followed Scott, the growth of our podcast, where it's like, we've been looking at all these different topics in maybe something of like a partial vacuum. We had something of a, equity awakening, last summer. And so I think that's a lens we're now trying to bring to all this stuff too. So I think that's just a good theme that's perhaps percolating all these different conversations going on across the sustainability space. But Mark, I do want to start transitioning now into all of the incredible carbon pricing work that RFF is doing. And it is like tools and resources galore, right? So
Yeah.
One resource in particular that caught our eye is the carbon pricing bill tracker, which helps people compare bills introduced in the 116th and 117th Congress that would implement a price on carbon emissions. It notes that more than 10 different carbon pricing bills have been introduced in the past 10 years. So our question for you is, are there any proposals or bills in there that you feel are particularly unique or perhaps didn't get enough attention that you want to tell our listeners about now?
So the two bills that I think that have been interesting and different is, the first one is the Market Choice Act. This Market Choice Act was introduced by former Representative Curbelo, and then it's been reintroduced by Representative Fitzpatrick. And what's interesting about it is those are the two policies that have been introduced by solid Republicans. And the other interesting thing about it is that it takes the revenues from it and uses them to eliminate the federal gasoline tax. So you can think of it as a swap between a carbon tax and a federal gasoline tax, and then with the additional revenue going to fully fund the Highway Trust Fund. So that's something that we hadn't really seen before in terms of thinking about tax swaps. The tax swap proposals before had been more like a payroll tax reduction in terms of the revenue. So this was kind of a new idea, and it's interesting because I think that those representatives were looking at was trying to minimize the impact on the price at the pump, which is obviously a politically sensitive issue.
So did you say that that one they were going to eliminate the gasoline tax as part of that?
They're going to eliminate the federal gasoline tax and replace it with the carbon tax.
It's interesting because I would have thought you'd almost want to keep that there, because why not tax gasoline use as a way to maybe get people to use their cars less, but also if the gasoline tax is being used to, say, fund roads, then you're taxing the people that are benefiting the most from the use of the tax.
Yeah, I think it's a political calculation. I think the idea is to minimize the impact on the price of the pump. And so, it would increase the price of gasoline. It would just do less. And so the idea is like a $35 carbon tax is equivalent to about a 35-cent increase in the price of gasoline, or a 35-cent tax on gasoline.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Kind of the rule of thumb is that a $1 carbon price is equivalent to a 1 cent tax on gasoline. And so, with an 18.2 cent federal gasoline tax and a $35 carbon tax, you swap that out, you're only increasing, the federal tax by 17 cents instead of 35 cents. And then you're using the revenues to fully fund the Highway Trust Fund, and then do some other infrastructure improvements.
Got it. Thank you.
So that's one of the bills that I think has been interesting because of the way that they have proposed the revenue use. And I think the other one that's interesting is the one that was most recently introduced, which is the Save Our Future Act by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Brian Schatz, and a variety of other Senate co-sponsors. And the reason I find this one is interesting is that this is the first one that puts a tax on local air pollutants as well as a tax on carbon dioxide. And so what it does is it establishes monitoring and reporting of all major sources of criteria air pollutants. Mm-hmm. And any major source within or near environmental justice community is required to pay a fee per pound of nitrogen oxide, fine particulate matter, or sulfur dioxide that they emit, in addition to having to pay for the carbon dioxide. And so this is the first one that I think was really kind of trying to target these environmental justice communities. And so environmental justice communities have skepticism about market-based policies. And the skepticism is that while we're going to reduce emissions kind of overall, we're going to concentrate those emissions and the resulting local air pollutants that come out of fossil fuel combustion, we're going to concentrate those in poor communities. And so there's this fear among environmental justice communities that this is any market-based policy, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade policy, will lead to this. And so this was the first bill that I've seen that try to specifically address this issue by not only taxing local air pollutants in EJ communities, but also using the revenues from those taxes to directly benefit those communities.
I mean, this goes back, Jay, to what you were highlighting after Mark talked about is the equity side of things. And now I like this bill where it's not just taking the revenue and spending it in a way that helps address that issue, but goes beyond carbon and looks at the other air pollutants and thinking about, well, how do we put a price on those and use the revenues to create more equity and reduce the environmental impact. So I really like it. I'm thinking with these two bills, we're seeing interesting approaches. And that makes me think of another tool you all offer, which is this carbon pricing calculator, where people can build their own carbon pricing policy, compare it to existing proposals. Sounds like a fun game. I'm sure it's going to be all the rage with the kids. And if people want to check it out, rff.org/topics, carbon-pricing. So can you talk to us about this tool? Like, how are people engaging with it? Have you seen any interesting insights where you're like, oh, I didn't think about that, but that's interesting how you use the tool. I'm going to go look at that further.
So I think the tool has been really great. I think it's a great way to provide information to policymakers, interested stakeholders, kind of just the interested in public. So there's the way I've seen it used most is there's a group called Citizens Climate Lobby, and they are a grassroots organization consisting of thousands of volunteers at the grassroots level who are working towards passing the Energy Innovation and Dividend Act. And so I routinely see people cite the calculator when they are writing letters to the editor to the Sacramento Bee or
that's cool,
or their local newspaper, and so it's been very accessible. And the other thing I like it is because back when only one carbon pricing proposal was being written a year, we would write an issue brief and maybe be a 2 or 3 page document.
Sure.
But as soon as we started getting more and more policies being proposed, that wasn't going to be an efficient way of looking at the policies. So what we wanted to do first was look at all the proposals, the bills, and put them into one place so that people could do an apples to apples comparison. A lot of times what happens is that one version of a model will be used to look at a policy in 2015, and then the model will change, and then that model will look at a policy in 2017, or one model will look at one policy introduced in 2019, and another model will look at a different policy introduced in 2019. And so you look at the differences, and some of those could be driven by model assumptions or the specific model that was used or the data behind it. And so, what was nice about the carbon calculator is that we're able to put all those policies in one model, the same set of assumptions, so we can look at an apples to apples comparison. So no model is correct. I'm not saying that these projections that I'm putting out there would necessarily come to pass. There are certainly large error bars in these projections. But what's nice is that it shows across a wide range of outcomes how these policies differ, with where you're holding fixed kind of all the model assumptions and the data behind it. And then what we want to do is allow people to kind of build their own policies and think about, okay, well, if we started at low or started at high, what would be the different implications on, say, consumer prices or the distributional impacts across households or states?
Yeah. Well, first, let me say, going back to something you said earlier, I like how the calculator from the Impartial economists is equipping the activists to make their argument. So that's cool. And I totally get the value of what you're saying of allowing for this apples to apples comparison, letting people play.
Exactly.
All right. So, Mark, we've been talking about tools galore, and I think we all feel comfortable knowing that a guy of your caliber is behind these tools, right? To help us understand what different proposals might look like in different scenarios. But now let's pivot to the carbon pricing that we're seeing in practice today. So the first question is, when you look globally at the different carbon pricing schemes currently in practice, are there any that you find to be particularly well done that get that economist heart of yours beating especially fast?
So British Columbia implemented the first revenue neutral carbon tax that took the revenues and used them to they used the revenues to offset corporate taxes and reduce and then also through to households through some reductions actually gave the checks to some of the households in British Columbia. So that started in 2008 and it started pretty small, $5, and it rose $5 a year and then kind of capped out at $30 for a long time. So I think that's a great example of what a true revenue neutral carbon price can and could look like. And that's something that, economists tend to particularly favor. So I think
like
that was
revenue
well
neutral,
done.
just to interrupt quickly, like revenue neutral, meaning the government doesn't make extra money off it. It does raise revenue, but that revenue is immediately distributed.
Yes, the revenues are raised, but they go back to households and firms through reductions in taxes or checks or reductions in their electricity bills or whatever way that they think about it. And actually, British Columbia actually has an interesting provision in their rule that says that if the revenues have not been used, if the revenues don't all go back to the households, then like the provincial treasurer, or I can't remember the title, the person actually loses their job.
That'll do it.
That's accountability right there.
That is the accountability. That's the enforcement mechanism. So Canada has also introduced Canada is really trying to look at strong climate policy. And what they introduced a few years ago was a kind of a province federal policy. And so what happens in Canada is that each province is required to have a certain ambition on climate policy, and they're allowed to do whatever climate policy they want, but it has to stack up to some level. And what happens is that the provinces refuse to do this, and notably Ontario was one of these provinces. Then
the problem child.
The federal government will step in and impose its own policy, and the policy they're actually implementing is a carbon price that will be pretty high by the end of the decade. I think it might actually even reach triple digits by the end of the decade.
Wow!
And all the revenues are refunded back to households through dividends, which is something I briefly mentioned previously. So I think that's going to be an interesting policy, and seeing how they've started a few years ago, and it survived political challenges from conservatives who actively tried to campaign against it. So this is one of the things I think that's underrated about thinking about carbon pricing policy is its political durability. And so each country has election cycles, and even if you get a carbon pricing policy in place, it can always go away if the political winds change. And Australia is a great example of this. Australia put a cap and trade program in that was supposed to kind of transition into a carbon tax. And the Conservatives campaigned specifically on getting rid of it, and they won. And one of their first actions was to get rid of that climate policy. And Australia has had no other type of climate policy since then. And so so in Canada, we actually saw the Conservatives actively campaigning against the climate policy that the Trudeau government was implementing. Trudeau's government, they didn't win a majority, but through the coalition with a even further left-wing progressive party, was able to become the ruling party through the ruling coalition and keep the climate policy in place.
And so, Mark, that's really interesting. Two examples from our neighbors to the north, and we're speaking about political wins and spin potentially and all that stuff. So I have to ask, we know that there are 11 states here in the US that have some sort of carbon pricing mechanism, but when do you think the US will adopt one nationally?
That's a great question.
Jay, if he knew the answer to that, he'd be a rich man. So
yeah, so there's actually been a lot of chatter about carbon pricing this year that I was not expecting, and I think part of that is because of the narrow majority in the Senate. So I think what really is going to be needed is either the carbon tax can be passed through reconciliation, where Democrats have 50 votes and the vice president breaks the tie, or you get enough Republican senators on board to get the policy through normal Senate rules. And under the first part, reconciliation requires that all Democrats are on board. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia famously shot a carbon pricing bill in a campaign video back in 2009, 2010. So I think it's really going to come down to whether or not senators like him, Democratic senators like him, the ones that are the more conservative Democratic members of the caucus, could actually support such a carbon pricing bill. And it's unclear to me whether or not that could happen. I don't have any particular insight into what he or his office are thinking, but I do think that's going to be the biggest hurdle, at least in this Congress, through the reconciliation. The other way is to get Republicans on board, and that seems unlikely under the current politics of everything, not just climate.
Yeah.
It's hard to see Republicans wanting to give Joe Biden a win, even if privately they might actually think that a carbon pricing policy is the best type of climate policy we could have. So, I've heard people talk about there are Republican senators who are ready to support a carbon pricing bill. But I've heard that since I've been in Washington, D.C. starting in 2013. And so until I see it, I'm not going to hold my breath.
It's the same old story with so much. It's either like reconciliation or regular order, and can you get all the Democrats to stick together? So, but I appreciate that. I do want to ask, though, you gave that example of Australia and how with political winds changing, they removed their carbon pricing scheme. So are there any stories like that, other ones that you want to talk about that are cautionary tales of programs that were taken away, programs that didn't really work, that you want to talk about with the listeners?
I mean, so Australia is obviously the classic example of a liberal government trying to implementing a policy, and then there's the backlash against it. Another example is the Yellow Vest movement in France. So France has the EU ETS, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which covers power sector and kind of major industrial emitters. And so across the entire European Union, it covers about 44% of emissions. And President Macron wanted to implement a carbon tax that would have covered the transportation sector in particular. So it would raise the price of gasoline even further than it already is in France, knowing that the price of gasoline there is already quite high relative to what it is in the US. And that kind of raised a lot of resentment in rural communities and led to this Yellow Vest. And so a lot of people like to point to, well, if we can't implement a carbon tax on transportation in France, where are we going to be able to implement it anywhere else? And I don't think that's quite right, because I think one of the things that some of the resentment towards that policy weren't just because of the potential carbon price on transportation fuels, but at the same time there was proposals to change the way that estate taxes were levied that would have favored the rich. And so I think it was kind of a package deal, but a lot of people who are opposed to carbon pricing like to point to the Yellow Vest protest. But I do think there was something a little bit more there.
Well, Mark, these are such critical, pressing topics and questions, and I think it's fantastic that we're here discussing them. As we start looking now towards the future, And we've got our definers listening along saying, carbon pricing, this is something that I want to keep learning more and more about because it is just so clearly critical. Our question to you is, are there any other tools and resources outside of RFF, perhaps other thought leaders as well, that focus on carbon pricing that you would recommend our listeners check out?
The advocacy groups like Climate Leadership Council or Citizens Climate Lobby put out some really good pieces, but we also have to understand that they are coming from an advocacy position of trying to push for the policies. But I do find that they write good pieces. From a kind of a more objective standpoint, the World Bank has a carbon pricing dashboard, which actually shows all the jurisdictions in the world that have a carbon price, or either through an emissions trading scheme or through a tax. And so it's a good tool to kind of see where this has been implemented around the world. And so I think that's a good one to check out.
Awesome.
Any specific people that you're like, oh, they really put out good stuff on this, you should follow them?
So Adele Morris is a researcher at Brookings Institution. She's heavily invested in thinking about carbon pricing and research on carbon pricing. She's always put out good things. There's a group at Columbia University that is a Center for Energy and Global Policy or something like that, and they usually put out some good material. And I have a friend named Joe Mikett, who is at the Niskanen Center, which is kind of a middle centrist libertarian focused group, and so they're focused on a number of topics, but especially climate, and their group usually puts out some pretty good pieces as well.
Awesome.
Okay, and so that's helpful as people want to read up more on this. And sticking with this theme of the future, are you hopeful that there will be more carbon pricing schemes in place, or do you think that the laggards like the U.S. and Australia will just kind of stay where they are? And I know it's hard to predict these things, but do you think that all the great stuff that you're putting out there, people are actually going to implement and put it in practice?
That'd be great if they did. I'm not holding my breath in the near term, but I do think eventually you'll see a price on carbon pretty much everywhere across the globe, or similar policies that achieve similar things, maybe with different costs and distributional outcomes. But I think it's going to take time, and I've been working on this for 13 years now. Some of my colleagues have been working on this for 25 or 30 years.
Yeah,
and so it's something that I don't think is going to happen overnight. I could see maybe by the end of the decade, maybe the middle of the next decade, we might kind of start moving in that direction.
Yeah, and you talk about not holding your breath in the near term and all these years that you and some of your peers have been working on this. I mean, we did an episode, what was it, Jay, like 2-3 months ago that was on eco-anxiety and this idea of people, the mental health side of these issues being overwhelming and the impact, and sometimes feeling like things aren't moving fast enough, or individually I can't do enough, so you just sort of throw up your hands and get overwhelmed. So is that something you feel, and how do you cope with it as a researcher and keep plugging away?
So I wrote a book. It's called Confronting the Climate Challenge, U.S. Policy Options, with Professor Larry Goulder at Stanford, who I worked with, and is how it kind of fell into this area of research. And we've been working on this book for a year or so. And then when President Trump won the 2016 election, that next day was pretty deflating.
Yeah,
because I knew what it meant for climate policy over the next 4 years. And so what I did is I went on vacation, which was fortuitously timed. And I just came back and said, you know what, let's just keep on plugging away. It'll be there if policymakers want to come back to it. And interestingly enough, we probably had more interest in our work during the Trump administration than we did towards the end of the Obama administration on carbon pricing. And part of that was maybe people knew it wasn't going to be a policy that could necessarily be passed, but they wanted some of these these leaders on the Hill wanted to signal their climate virtue by talking about carbon pricing.
Yeah, or state level stuff. Yeah.
Carbon pricing bills. But then we also saw a lot of interest from states. And so that's something that we hadn't really had in our toolkit. And so since then, we've developed a regional model that's been able to look at and address carbon pricing from a state level. And there's been a ton of interest in that. We wrote a report for the state of Vermont. I wrote a report on Colorado, and we're doing some work on some other states as we speak. And so there's just been a lot of interest since 2016 that I did not expect at all after the election. And so that's been nice to see that people are still wanting to talk about this, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to an immediate policy impact. And so I think at the times when I'm experiencing the eco anxiety of I'm spending all this time working on something that's never going to be passed, is that maybe the timing is right now, but my research will be there. It will be on the shelf. People can cite it when it does come around and is talked about again.
No, I get it. I mean, sometimes it's important to step away and then get back to it and trust that it will be turned to when the time is right and that you're laying the groundwork. So, all right, Jay, I think it's time for the party question, huh?
Right. So, Mark, on top of all of this fantastic stuff we've discussed in this conversation, and again, I think I speak for the listeners here as well, just appreciating the resolve you're bringing to your work, especially after, confronting the eco-anxiety stuff that we all experience. We're now going to ask you our famous last question, which we call our party question.
Okay.
So the question is, if we are at a party and the topic of carbon pricing comes up, we want to share a party fact with whoever it is that we're talking about and geeking about this stuff with that will just blow their brains, have them drop their drinks. Just, wow, this is the most amazing fact that I can share on carbon pricing. We ask you what that fact is.
I mean, I don't know if it's a very entertaining party if we're starting to get into carbon pricing.
Our listeners, Mark, are used to these kind of parties, so I think we're in good company.
Okay. So in the United States, to achieve a level of emissions that's 50% below 2005 levels, my research shows you need a $70 carbon price.
Okay.
Scott, that doesn't, maybe I'm just not nearly as in the weeds here, but it doesn't strike me as being that much, right? For such an insane reduction. I mean, that's...
Especially if it's,
a motivating stat.
It's revenue neutral.
Yeah, awesome. and the power sector is very responsive to a carbon price. I mean, the power sector does not need a $70 carbon price to reduce its emissions by 50%. And so you're getting significant emissions reductions from the power sector and less emissions reductions from the other sectors. But as I said, my research shows that that's kind of the price that you need, give or take a little bit, depending on what year you start, to achieve that target.
Okay. Well, Jay, I think that about does it. Mark, we really appreciate your time and look forward to seeing your future research. And hopefully it comes sooner than we think and people act on it and we get more carbon pricing schemes done in an efficient, effective way. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Scott, as we're winding down this episode, I'm trying to think of all these different carbon dioxide sources to potentially price, right?
Okay.
Doesn't everyone produce CO2 when we exhale? I mean, do we need to be paying a tax for breathing?
Oh, yeah, people are going to love that. And you have to wear, a mask so we know exactly how much you emitted?
Right, and so we'll know the heavy breathers, We're not just relying on sound anymore. We can see who you guys
it could be combined with, a COVID protection mask.
Oh.
That's good. It helps protect you from viruses, but also we track your carbon emissions.
Right. One of the best ways to not get COVID is just stop breathing, right?
Yeah. People are taking less breaths on purpose to avoid higher taxes.
Right.
Oh my God.
All right. So with that, let's run down the folks we'd like to thank for helping us make this episode.
Yes.
First off, we thanked her once. Let's thank her again. Amelia Kovac, who is our new researcher here at the podcast. She has come on and made such an immediate splash, and we've just been so pumped to have her.
First episode, Jay, carbon pricing. I mean, that's not easy.
Yeah, we didn't throw her exactly a fastball down the middle here.
No.
But on this theme of folks that help us just make this Big shout out to Keaton Butler for helping us again stitch this all together in a way that makes sense to you guys and hopefully in a way that makes us sound good. Of course, we'd also like to thank Square Peg, Round Hole, and Potions for the music we use in this episode. And of course, Definers, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts.
Jay, I have some bad news, though. I went to find, the review, because we read one every episode that I would read. And like last episode, the last review was in May.
Oh, goodness.
So, yet again, if someone had written a review, you would have been it. So,
guys,
please,
the door is wide open.
Wide open. Go ahead, write a review. Take a minute, pause, come back. It's very easy. Just go into Apple Podcasts, do your thing. So we had to go back to the archives, Jay. We found one from Herman Korn. Perhaps it's Herman Cain. And his, I don't know. But because he could have written it, May 14th, 2016.
And Scott, we were so doe-eyed back then.
Oh, early, very weeks in. And the title here is Susdeft, like SUSDEF''D. It says, lighthearted, informative podcast that offers useful information delivered in an inspiring way that raises awareness and encourages positive changes in order to help the environment. I mean, Jay, it's very straightforward, very nice. I thought Herman Korn was going to, I don't know, kind of blow us away with something clever, but we'll take it. I thank you, Herman.
Yeah, Herman's just a matter-of-fact guy. He'll tell you what he needs to tell you, and then that's it.
Yeah, that's fair.
But Herman, it's great to hear, so thanks for writing that. Way back when, like 5 years ago. Thanks, Herman.
Yeah. All right, Jay. I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.